Chapter 13 of With Cortez in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. With Cortez in Mexico by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 13. The Massacre of Cholula. The Tlascalans had, from the moment when they admitted themselves beaten by the Spaniards, laid aside all hostility, and had, indeed, accepted the alliance with enthusiasm. They had a right to be proud of their own valor, for they had resisted all the attempts of the great Aztec monarchy to conquer them, and had defeated with slaughter greatly superior forces, and that a mere handful of white men should be able to withstand their attacks day after day, and to defeat their best and hardiest troops, led by generals who had hitherto been always successful, excited their surprise and admiration in the highest degree. They were not gods, they knew, for some had been killed in the conflict, but as men they seemed to them infinitely superior in strength and courage to any that they had before heard of, and they were proud to enter into an alliance with such heroes. Moreover, they saw they would now have an opportunity of turning the tables upon their enemies of the plains. They did not believe for a moment that Montezuma would admit the white men to his capital, and in that case there would be great battles, and perhaps much plunder to be gained. And therefore, when the Spaniards were again ready to advance, the whole fighting force of Tlascala was placed at their disposal. Cortez, however, declined to take with him so large an army. The appearance of such a force, composed of the bitter foes of the Aztecs, would have combined against him the whole strength of that empire, and would have destroyed any hope that might remain of peaceful arrangements. Moreover, the difficulty of feeding so large a body of men would be great, indeed; and as his authority over them would be but feeble, constant broils with the Aztecs would be the inevitable result. He, therefore, with many thanks, declined the offer, but said that he would gladly take with him a force of 6,000 volunteers. The first march was to be to Cholula, whose people had sent a warm invitation to Cortez to visit them, and Montezuma, by his last envoys, also requested them to journey forward by way of that city. The Tlascalans had strongly urged him to refuse the invitation. The Cholulans were, they said, a treacherous people, and not to be trusted. They were bigoted beyond the people of other cities, Cholula being the holy city of Anahuac. It were here the god Quetzalcoatl had remained for 20 years on his way down to the coast, instructing the people in the arts of civilization. Here was the great temple of the god, a pyramid whose base covered 44 acres, and whose height was 180 feet, the platform on its summit, where the sacrifices took place, being an acre in size. Cortez, however, decided upon visiting Cholula. He deemed the reports of the Tlascalans to be prejudiced, as there was a long-standing animosity between the two peoples, and he thought that, were he to avoid visiting this important town, which lay almost on his road to Mexico, it might be set down by the Aztecs to distrust or fear. The departure from Tlascala was witnessed by the whole of the population of the state, who assembled to bid the white men farewell, and to wish them success upon their way. A day's march took them to within a mile or two of Cholula. Here they were met by many nobles from the city, who urged them to enter it that evening. But Cortez, bearing in mind the warnings he had received, and thinking it dangerous to enter the streets of an unknown and possibly hostile city after dark, declined to move forward until morning. Seeing the hostility and distrust excited in the minds of his visitors at the sight of the Tlascalans in his camp, he ordered his allies to remain in camp when he advanced in the morning, and to join him only when he left the city on his way to Mexico. The Spaniards, as they entered Cholula, were greatly struck with the appearance of the city and its inhabitants, it being a very much larger and more highly civilized place than any they had yet met with. The buildings were large and handsome, the streets wide, the population very large, and exhibiting in their dress every sign of wealth and luxury. There was, too, a great variety among the population, for, as it was the sacred city of the empire, people from all other parts were in the habit of making pilgrimages there. And most of the towns had their own temples and establishments. So numerous were the temples that fully 200 towers could be counted, rising above the city, with the stupendous pyramid towering above them all. The Spaniards were quartered in the court of one of the temples, and in the surrounding buildings. As soon as they were established there, the principal nobles of the town paid them visits of ceremony, and presents of everything necessary for their comfort and accommodation, and stores of provisions of all kinds poured in. Roger had, in the line of march, taken his place among the troops, but Cortez directed that he should, at other times, be near at hand to him, as he alone of those in the army had any personal knowledge of the country they were to traverse, and could give information as to the size of the towns, the nature of the roads, and the advantages which these offered, respectively, in the supply of provisions likely to be obtained, the facilities for getting water, etc. Cortez, therefore, Father Aquilar acting as interpreter, enjoined him to ramble about the city, releasing him from all guards and exercises. "Now that you are dressed like the rest of us," he said, "none will dream that you understand their language, and as you pass along they will express freely before you the sentiments they may entertain of us. I do not expect them to love us, and doubtless, though they may flatter us to our faces, they curse us heartily behind our backs. But we care nothing for their curses or their ill will, so long as they do not proceed to plots and conspiracies against us. They seem courteous and friendly, and I think that the Tlascalans have spoken far too strongly against them. Nevertheless, we will be on our guard. These men are not like our mountain friends, who were rough fighters, but hardy and honest people. They are traders or nobles or priests, accustomed to let their faces hide their thoughts, but through you we may get nearer to them than we otherwise should do. But go not alone. One man can easily be jostled into one of the temples and made away with, without any being the wiser. I will choose 2 comrades for you, men of discretion, and courageous without being quarrelsome. With them, too, you will, ere long, begin to recover your mother tongue, which you will never do so long as you only talk these heathen languages with Marina and Father Aquilar." Cortez struck the table with his hand, and an attendant entered. "Summon Juan Alganes and Pedro de Gasconda." In a minute 2 men entered. Juan was a weather-beaten soldier, whose face bore the marks of several deep scars, and who had fought for Spain on most of the battlefields of Europe. Pedro was young enough to be his son. Juan had saved his life in a fight with the natives of Cuba, and since then they had been inseparable. "Juan, I have sent for you to ask you and Pedro to take our new comrade into your party. I know you are always together, and that you are quiet and peaceable, and not given either to quarrel in your cups or to spend your evenings in gambling and dicing. He has, as you know, almost forgotten his own language, and it will be for our advantage, as well as his own, that he should learn it as soon as possible, for as he knows the country and people, it is well that he should be able to communicate with the rest of us, without having to hunt up an interpreter. But that is not the principal thing just at the present moment. We know not whether the people of this city mean treacherously towards us or not. They will not speak in the presence of Donna Marina or of the good father here, knowing that they are acquainted with the language. But as they will not imagine that this tall Spanish soldier can know aught of what they say, they will not mind speaking out their thoughts before him. Therefore, while he is here, it is his duty to wander about the streets and learn what the people are saying and what they think of us. But here, as elsewhere, I have ordered that not less than 3 men shall go out together. I have chosen you to accompany him. You will be free from all other duty." "That we will do, right willingly," Juan said. "It is pleasanter to walk about the streets and look at these strange peoples than it is to be cooped up here. As to the other part of the business, we will do what we can towards teaching him Spanish. But as to being our comrade, that must depend upon himself. I like the young fellow's looks much. He looks honest and straightforward, though where he got that light wavy hair and that fair skin from I can't guess. They are rare enough in Cadiz, where I heard one say that he came from." "We don't know that he came from there, Juan. He may have come from the mountains of Biscaya, where fair skins are commoner than they are in the south. It is only that he described to us a port, which must have been Cadiz, as the last thing he recollected in Spain." "Ah, well, his skin matters nothing," the soldier said. "His face is an honest one, and as to height and strength, one could wish no better comrade. He is young yet, not more than 19 or 20, I should guess, but I will warrant that there is not a man in the expedition he could not put on his back, if it came to a tussle. At any rate, we will try him. What do you say, Pedro?" "I like his looks," the young fellow said. "At any rate, we are not like to quarrel with him. As to more than that, we can say better when we know more of each other." Father Aquilar, who had listened attentively to all that had been said, explained to Roger the purport of the conversation between Cortez and the men. When he had finished, Roger held out his hand to the 2 soldiers and gave them a hearty grasp, expressive of his willingness to join in the arrangement that had been made. "He will do, General," Juan said. "We will look after him, never fear." Cortez gave orders that the 3 men were to be allowed to leave the quarters and go into the town at all times, without further question, and they at once started for a turn through the streets. "How are we to begin to teach this young chap to talk, Pedro? It is out of the regular line of duty, altogether." Pedro shook his head. "I don't know, comrade. I have heard women teaching their babies to talk, but I should hardly think that would be the way with him." No, that is quite different, Pedro. You see, the little ones have not got their tongues twisted rightly, and they can't talk plain, do as much as they will. But this young fellow could say, plain enough, what we told him. The question is, what are we to tell him? Suppose I say to him, 'They are a curiously dressed lot of people here.' Well, he might say it after me, but as he would not have an idea what we meant, I don't see that we should be getting any forwarder." Roger, however, had already gone through the work of learning the 2 native languages, and knew how to begin. He touched Juan's sword, and gave the Mexican word for it. "What does he mean by that, Pedro?" Roger repeated the action. "Perhaps he wants to know what you call your sword," Pedro suggested. "Perhaps it is that. I will try him anyhow." "Spada." Roger nodded and repeated the word after him, and then touched his own helmet. "This is what he means," Juan said, with great satisfaction. "What he has got to do is to touch things, and for us to tell him the names." "That is capital. I had no idea teaching a language was such easy work." However, after a few more words had been said, and a method established, Roger had no more questions. His companions being now fully occupied in gazing at the houses, the temples, and the crowd in the streets, while he himself was busy listening to the remarks of the people. It was curious to him to hear everyone around freely discussing them, assured that no word they said was understood. Had he been vain, he would have felt gratified at the favorable comments passed on his personal appearance by many of the women and girls, but he put them down entirely to the fact that he differed more from them than did the Spaniards, and it was simply the color of his hair and the fairness of his skin that seemed wonderful to the Mexicans. "Ah," he heard one woman say to another, "I marked that tall soldier when they came into the town this morning. They are all grand men, and look wonderfully strong and brave with their arms and armor. I know that such fighters as these were never heard of before, for have they not, few as they are, beaten the Tlascalans? Who, as we all know, are good fighters, though they are little better than savages. But as to their faces, they were not what I expected to see. They are lighter than ours, but they are not white. But I noted this soldier. He is just like what I expected, just like what they said the white man, who has been at Mexico for some time, is like." "I am sorry for them," the girl said. "They say that Montezuma will offer them all up at the temples, when he gets them to Mexico." "Perhaps they will never get there," a man standing next to her said. "At least, unless they enter the town as captives." "Perhaps some of them will stay here. Why should not our God have his share of victims, as well as the war god of Mexico?" The speaker was a priest who was scowling angrily at the three Spaniards, who, after stopping to look at the carving over the gate of a temple, were now moving on again. But although Roger heard occasional remarks that showed it was the opinion of the inhabitants that Montezuma had only allowed these strangers to enter his country for the purpose of destroying them, there was no general feeling of hostility to them, the satisfaction at the defeat they had inflicted upon Tlascala far outweighing any other feeling. After wandering about for some hours, the party returned to their quarters, where Roger gave, through Malinche, to Cortez an account of what he had noticed. "There is nothing new in that," Cortez said. "We know that Montezuma has done all in his power to prevent us from coming, and that now he knows he has wasted his treasures in vain. He must feel no good will towards us. However, we shall be prepared for him. But continue your search. There may be a change come. Montezuma may, even now, be preparing to crush us. If so, as soon as the people here know it, you will see a change in their demeanor. The priests are all powerful here, and the devils whom they worship are sure to set them on to do us mischief, if they can. Therefore, relax not your watchfulness. Marina and yourself are the only two among us who understand their language, and it is upon you both that we have to depend, to shield us from treachery. Against an open assault I have no fear, but in a crowded town like this, an attack at night might be fatal." Cortez had, indeed, taken the precaution upon his arrival of stating to the nobles that, as it would be inconvenient for Marina to reside in buildings occupied solely by men, he should be glad if one of their wives would receive her as a guest, and she was accordingly installed at once in the house of one of the principal nobles. Some days passed, as Cortez was waiting for the arrival of a fresh embassy from Montezuma. During that time, Roger was unable to detect any change in the attitude of the population. The Spaniards were greeted courteously when they went abroad, and their leaders were entertained at fetes and banquets by the nobles. Roger and his two comrades were well satisfied with each other. Juan was a taciturn soldier, but he was amused at the efforts of Pedro and Roger to converse. "I am glad, Pedro," he said, on the third day of their making acquaintance with Roger, "that this young fellow has joined. If I had had my will, I should have said nay when Cortez proposed it. But it is good for you, lad. It is well enough for an old soldier like me to toil along all day without speaking, under a burning sun, and to say but little, even over his cup of wine, at the end of the march. But it is not good for a lad like you. You were getting old before your time. I could sing a song and dance a measure with the best of them when I was at your age, and you see what has come of my campaigning, for, like yourself, I took to an old soldier for a comrade. This young fellow seems to have a cheerful spirit, and when he can talk our language well, will be a gay companion, and will do you good." "Yes, and do me good too, Pedro. You are too apt to get into my moods, and be silent when I am silent, and thus I make you dull, while you do not make me bright. Only I want to see this young fellow at work, before I quite give him my heart. I believe that he will bear himself bravely. It were a shame, indeed, if there should be faint heart in a body of such thews and muscle. Truly he is a stately figure, and has the air of the great noble rather than a rough soldier. But that, I take it, comes from his being brought up among these Mexicans, who, though in most respects ignorant, carry themselves with much dignity, and with a stately and gentlemanly manner, such as one sees in Europe, chiefly in men of good blood. On the evening of the 4th day, the embassy arrived from Montezuma. The emperor had apparently again changed his mind, for he expressed his regret at their determination to visit the capital, and begged them to relinquish the idea. Upon leaving Cortez, the ambassadors had an interview with several of the chief nobles of Cholula. They left for the capital again in the night. The next morning a change was visible in the behavior of the people. They no longer visited the Spanish quarters, but held aloof from them. The nobles, upon being invited to come to see Cortez, sent in excuses on the ground of illness, or that they were about to undertake a journey, or other pretexts, and the supply of provisions sent in fell off greatly. Roger and his comrades also marked a great difference in the manner of the people in the streets. The buzz of talking and laughing was hushed as they approached. People turned away, as if desirous of avoiding the sight of them, the priests regarding them with an insolent air. On one or two occasions they were roughly jostled, and on arriving at the end of a street, the people gathered round, and by words and gesture told them to go no farther. Cortez had particularly enjoined in Roger and his companions against embroiling themselves in any way with the people, and they therefore suffered themselves to be turned back without exhibiting any air of concern. But Juan muttered many oaths beneath his mustache, and Roger and Pedro had difficulty in restraining their anger. Cortez looked very grave upon hearing Roger's report on their return. "I fear that treachery is intended," he said, "and if I did but know it, I would be beforehand with them. You had best not go abroad again, for it may be their intention to provoke a quarrel by an affray in the streets. I will send some of the Campoalans who are with us out. They will be less observed, and may find out what is going on." "I think," Marina said, "that if we go up to the flat roof, we may see something of what is going on. This house is more lofty than most." Cortez, with Roger and the girl, ascended to the roof. From it they commanded a considerable prospect. On some of the roofs they could make out bodies of men at work, but these were too far off to see what they were doing. In the evening the Campoalans returned, and said that they had come upon barricades erected across several of the streets, and that on many of the roofs great stores and beams of timber were piled, while they had discovered holes dug in the streets, and covered with branches, and apparently intended to entrap cavalry. A portion of the troops were ordered to remain under arms all night, in case of attack, but the city remained quiet. In the course of the following day, some Tlascalans came in from their camp, and informed Cortez they had heard that a great sacrifice of children had been offered up in one of the temples, a custom which prevailed whenever an enterprise of a serious nature was about to be undertaken. They said, too, that large numbers of the citizens, with their wives and children, were leaving the town by the various gates. The situation had now become very grave, and Cortez and his officers were at a loss to know what had best be done, as they had still no positive proof that treachery was intended. This proof was, however, furnished by Marina next day. The wife of the cazique had taken a great fancy to her, and urged her to take up her abode altogether at her house, hinting that it would be safer for her to do so. Marina at once pretended that she should be glad to leave the white men who held her in captivity, in order that they might use her as an interpreter. The Cholulan then gave her a full account of the conspiracy. It was, she said, the work of the emperor, who had sent rich presents by the ambassadors to the great nobles, and had urged upon them the necessity of making an end of the white intruders. 20,000 troops had been marched down to within a short distance of the city, and these were to enter and take part in the assault on the Spaniards. The attack was to be made as these left the city. The streets were to be barricaded, and impediments to prevent the action of the cavalry placed in the way, and the Spaniards were to be overwhelmed with the missiles from the roofs, while the troops would pour out from the houses to the attack. Some of the Spaniards were to be sacrificed at the altars at Cholula, the rest to be marched in chains to the capital, and there put to death. This scheme was unfolded to Marina in her apartment in the Spanish quarters, and she appeared to assent to the proposal that she should, that night, leave the Spaniards altogether. Making an excuse to leave the room for a few minutes, Marina hastened to Cortez and informed him of what she had heard. The cazique's wife was at once seized, and being in terror of her life, she repeated the statements she had made to Marina. The news was alarming indeed. The position of the Spaniards in the midst of a hostile city seemed well nigh hopeless. The barricades and pitfalls would paralyze the action of the cavalry and artillery. Every house would be a fortress, and under such difficulties even the bravery of the handful of Spaniards would avail but little against the overwhelming force by which they would be attacked. Before deciding as to the best course to be adopted, Cortez determined to obtain further confirmation of the story of the cazique's wife. He accordingly sent an invitation to 2 priests, who resided in the temple close to his quarters, to visit him. When they came, he received them most courteously, but informed them that, by the powers he possessed, he was perfectly aware that treachery was intended. He bestowed upon them some very valuable presents from the gifts he had received from Montezuma, and promised that none should be aware that he had received any information from them. The rich bribes had their effect, and the priests confirmed the report Marina had heard. They said that the emperor had, since their arrival, been in a state of vacillation, constantly consulting the oracles, and unable to make up his mind whether to fight them or to receive them with honor. He had, when he heard that they were going to Cholula, first issued orders that they should be well received, but since then the oracles had again been consulted, and had declared that Cholula would be the grave of the white men, for that the gods would assuredly lend their aid in destroying the enemies who had dared to violate the sanctity of the holy city. He had, therefore, ordered the attack to take place in the manner described, and so certain were the Aztecs of success that the manacles to secure the prisoners had already been sent to the city. Cortez dismissed the priests, telling them that he intended to leave the city the following morning, and requested that they would induce the principal nobles engaged in the plot to pay him a visit at once. As soon as the priests had left, he summoned his principal officers and disclosed to them the plot he had discovered. There was much difference of opinion between them. Some were in favor of returning at once to the friendly city of Tlascala. Others voted for still advancing, but by the northerly route their allies had recommended. But the majority agreed with their general that their only chance of safety was in taking a bold course, for that retreat would raise the whole country against them and ensure their destruction. When the nobles arrived, Cortez rebuked them mildly for their altered conduct and for the failure of supplies, and said that the Spaniards would no longer be a burden upon the city, but would march out on the following morning, and requested that they would furnish a body of 2,000 men to transport his artillery and baggage. As this suited admirably the designs of the natives, they at once agreed to furnish the required force. Upon their leaving, Cortez had an interview with Montezuma's ambassadors, who had accompanied him from the coast, and told them that he was aware of the treacherous plot to destroy him and his army, and that he was grieved to find that this vile act of treachery was instigated by Montezuma. The ambassadors, astounded at what appeared to them the supernatural knowledge of Cortez, and terrified at the position in which they found themselves, made earnest protestations of their entire ignorance of the scheme, and declared that they were convinced that the emperor was wholly innocent of it, and that it was entirely the act of the Cholulans. Cortez pretended to believe them, as he was desirous, as long as possible, of keeping up a semblance of friendship with Montezuma, and declared that he was willing to believe that, after the friendly messages and gifts the emperor had sent, he could not be guilty of such baseness and treachery. His anger, therefore, would be directed chiefly against the Cholulans, who were guilty not only of foul treachery to himself, but of dishonoring the emperor's name by their conduct. As soon, however, as the ambassadors had retired, a strong guard was placed over them, to prevent them from communicating with the citizens. Every precaution was taken, in case the plans of the enemy should be altered, and an attack made during the night. The guns were placed so as to command the approaches. The horses were kept saddled and ready for action. Strong guards were placed, and the troops lay down in their armor. Orders were dispatched to the Tlascalans to hold themselves ready to march into the city in the morning, and join the Spaniards. As soon as daylight broke, the troops were under arms. A portion of those with the guns were posted outside the building, so as to sweep the streets. A strong body were told off to guard the 3 gates of entrance. The rest were drawn up in the great court, which was surrounded partly by buildings, partly by high walls. Soon after the arrangements were completed, the caziques arrived, having with them a body of men even larger than they had agreed to bring. As soon as they entered, Cortez called them to him, and informed him that he was acquainted with all the particulars of the conspiracy. He had come to that city upon the invitation of the emperor, and had given them no cause of complaint, and had left his allies outside the walls. Under the guise of kindness and hospitality, they had prepared a snare to cut off and destroy them. The Cholulans were astounded. It seemed to them useless to deny anything to men who could thus read their thoughts, and they confessed that the accusation was true. Cortez raised his hand. A gun gave the signal. A terrible volley was poured into the Cholulans, and the Spaniards then fell upon them with pikes and swords. The unfortunate natives, thus taken by surprise, and penned up like sheep in the enclosure, scarcely offered any resistance. Some tried to escape through the gateways, but were repulsed by the troops stationed there. Others strove, but in vain, to scale the walls, and the only survivors of the massacre owed their lives to hiding under the great piles of dead. In the meantime, the Mexicans without, being made aware by the heavy firing of the failure of their plan of surprise, rushed from the buildings in which they had been stationed, and poured up to the assault. They were swept down by the discharges of the guns, but the places of the slain were rapidly filled, and with reckless bravery they pressed up to the Spaniards. Although Cortez, at the head of his cavalry, charged them again and again, so as to give the gunners time to reload. The struggle was still proceeding when the Tlascalans entered the gates of the city, and, coming up at a run to the scene of conflict, fell upon the rear of the Mexicans. These could no longer resist their terrible opponents, and, breaking their ranks, took refuge in the houses, or fled to the temples. One large body, headed by the priests, made a stand upon the great central teocalli. There was a tradition among them that, if its stones were removed, the god would pour out an inundation of water to overwhelm his enemies. The Cholulans tore down some of the stones, and when the expected miracle did not take place, were seized with despair. Many shut themselves up in the wooden towers on the platform of the summit, and poured down missiles on their foes as they climbed the great staircase. But the darts and arrows fell harmless upon the armor of the Spaniards, and when these gained the platform, they snatched up the blazing arrows shot at them, and fired the turrets. The Cholulans fought to the last, and either threw themselves over the parapet, or perished in the flames. In the meantime, many of the wooden houses in the town had caught fire, and the flames spread rapidly. The Spanish cavalry, charging through the street, trampled the Mexicans underfoot, while the Tlascalan allies gratified their long enmity against the Cholulans by slaying them without mercy. When all resistance had ceased, the victors burst into the houses and temples, and plundered them of their valuables. The sack continued for some hours, and then Cortez, at the entreaties of some Cholulan caziques who had been spared at the massacre, and of the Mexican ambassadors, consented to call off his troops, and 2 of the nobles were allowed to go into the town and to assure the surviving inhabitants that no further harm would be done to them, if they would return to their homes. The Spaniards and Tlascalans were drawn up under their respective leaders. The division of the booty offered no difficulties. The mountaineers attached no value to gold or jewels, and were well content with wearing apparel and provisions, while to the share of the Spaniards fell the valuables taken. Cortez had given strict orders that no violence should be offered to the women or children, and his orders had been respected. But many of these and numbers of men had been made prisoners by the Tlascalans to carry away into slavery. Cortez, however, now persuaded them to liberate their captives, and so great was his influence that they acceded to his request. The dead bodies were now collected and carried outside the city by the inhabitants. Cortez, in his letter to the Emperor Charles, says that 3,000 were slain, but most contemporary writers put down the number of victims at 6,000, and some at even a higher figure. Order was promptly restored. The inhabitants who had left the town speedily returned, and the people of the neighborhood flocked in with supplies. The markets were reopened, and only the lines of blackened ruins told of the recent strife. The massacre was a terrible one, and is a stain upon the memory of Cortez, who otherwise, throughout the campaign, acted mercifully, strictly prohibiting any plundering or ill treatment of the natives, and punishing all breaches of his orders with great severity. The best excuse that can be offered is, that in desperate positions, desperate measures must be taken. That the plot, if successful, would have resulted in the extermination of the Spaniards, and that the terrible lesson taught was necessary to ensure the safety of the expedition. Moreover, a considerable portion of those who fell in fair fight, and after the action was over, the inhabitants were well treated. It must, too, be taken into consideration that the Spaniards were crusaders as well as discoverers, and that it was their doctrine that all heretics must be treated as enemies of God, and destroyed accordingly. Such was not the doctrine of their church, for as the great historian Bede writes of King Ethelbert, he had learned, from the teachers and authors of his salvation, that men are to be drawn, not dragged, to heaven. Roger, with his 2 companions, had formed part of the force stationed outside the gates to resist the attack of the citizens, and he had taken his share in the fierce fighting that went on there. He was not free from the prejudices of his times, and the horrible sacrifices of the temples, and the narrow escape he himself had had in being offered up as a victim, had inspired him with a deep hatred of the religion of the people, although against them personally he had no feeling of hostility. Even in the height of the conflict, he felt pity for the men who, in their cotton armor, rushed so fearlessly to the attack of the iron-clad Spaniards, armed with their terrible weapons. But at the same time, he knew that if they were successful, the most horrible fate awaited him and his companions, and the treacherous plot, of which they had so nearly been the victims, excited the same feelings in his mind as in that of the Spaniards. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of With Cortez in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. With Cortez in Mexico by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 14, In Mexico. The terrible vengeance taken by the Spaniards at Cholula struck terror into the minds of the Mexicans. The white men had shown, in their conflict with the Tlascalans, how terrible they were in battle, and it now seemed that treachery was of no avail against them. The cities in the neighborhood of Cholula hastened to send messages expressive of submission to the terrible white warriors, accompanied by presents of all kinds. Montezuma saw, with awe and affright, that even the oracles of the gods could not be depended upon against these strangers, and that bribes, force, and treachery had alike failed to arrest their march towards his capital. Vast numbers of victims were again offered up on the altars, but no favorable responses were returned, for the priests, seeing how complete had been the failure of their predictions as to events at Cholula, were unwilling again to commit themselves. The emperor, consequently, sent fresh ambassadors laden with presents to Cortez, with assurances that he was in no way responsible for the attack upon them, and that he considered they had done well in punishing its authors. Cortez endeavored to induce the inhabitants of the city to embrace Christianity, and would have resorted to force here as at Campoala, but he was dissuaded by Father Olmedo, who, as on former occasions, urged that conversions effected by force were of little use, and that the cause would be injured rather than benefited by such measures. Christianity would, as a matter of course, result from the success of the Spaniards, and that success would be imperiled by exciting the animosity of the whole people by violence to their gods. As the great teocalli had been captured in fair fight, and a large portion of its buildings burnt, Cortez converted a massive stone edifice that had escaped the flames into a church, and erected a gigantic crucifix on the summit of the teocalli, visible from all points of the city. A fortnight after his entrance to Cholula, Cortez again began to move forward. His Campoalan allies, who had fought with great bravery against the Tlascalans, and had rendered him immense assistance upon the march, now asked to be allowed to return home; for much as they believed in the prowess of the whites, the dread of Montezuma's name was too great for them to dare trust themselves in his capital. Cortez dismissed them with many presents, and, with his Tlascalan army, set forward towards the capital. As they proceeded on their way, parties came in from various towns on the plateau with friendly messages. The enormous taxation imposed to keep up the luxurious court of the emperor pressed heavily upon the land, and the greater portion of the inhabitants hailed, with real satisfaction, the coming of a power that appeared likely to overthrow the Aztec tyranny. Had it not been for this widespread disaffection, the little army of Cortez would, in spite of its bravery and superior weapons, have been powerless against the vast hosts which could have been hurled against it. But the people of the empire, in general, regarded Mexico as its oppressor and tyrant, and hailed the opportunity of freeing themselves from its dominations. Cortez, except when the question of religion was concerned, was politic in the highest degree, and inspired all the natives who came to him with the full belief that, in him, they would have a kind and generous protector against Montezuma. Warm as were the assurances of friendship sent by that monarch, the Spaniards were well aware that no confidence could be placed in them. Their new friends, indeed, informed them that he was already preparing for an attack upon the Spaniards, and that the straight and level road had been blocked up, in order that they might be forced to take their passage through the mountains, where they could be attacked and overwhelmed at points at which their cavalry and artillery would be unable to act. On arriving, therefore, at the place where the roads had been blocked, Cortez caused the piled-up obstacles to be removed, and the army proceeded by the level road, where they felt confident in their power to defend themselves if attacked. Upon the march, Roger sometimes kept with Juan and Pedro, at other times walked beside Malinche, who, although wholly devoted to Cortez, had yet a warm and kindly feeling for her former friend. Cortez himself often consulted Roger as to the roads and places ahead, for he always received the native descriptions with some doubt, as he could not be sure whether they were honestly given. After passing across the plateau, the little army ascended the steep range of hills separating it from the table land of Mexico. The cold was sufficient to affect them seriously after the heat of the plains, and the difficulties of taking up the guns and their ammunition were great. This work was principally performed by the native allies, the Spaniards holding themselves in readiness to repel any attack that might be made upon them, in the forest-clad hills or in the deep defiles. But no foes showed themselves, and they at last gained the western slopes, whence the plains of Mexico burst into sight. The Spaniards stood astonished, as Roger had done on his first journey, at the beauty of the prospect. But the sight of the numerous cities, telling of an immense population, filled them with uneasiness, and a clamor presently arose that to march onward against such overwhelming odds was nothing short of madness, and that, having accomplished such vast things, they had done sufficient for honor, and should now return with the spoils they had captured to the coast. But, as before, the enthusiasm and influence of Cortez soon reanimated their courage. He and the other leaders went among them, and by argument and entreaty persuaded them again to form their ranks and press forward, and in a short time the army wound down from the heights into the valley. Happily for them, the ruler of Mexico was altogether dominated by superstitious fears. Against native enemies he had shown himself a resolute and valiant leader, had carried on numerous successful wars, and had by force of arms greatly extended his dominions. But against these strange white enemies his faculties seemed altogether to fail him. He had for years given himself up to the priesthood, and in this crisis, instead of consulting with his trusted generals, he was swayed wholly by the advice of the priests, and sought protection not from the armies at his command, but from the gods, whom he strove to influence in his favor by hecatombs of human victims sacrificed upon their altars. In the month that had elapsed since he joined Cortez at Tlascala, Roger had made considerable progress in Spanish, and although incapable of supporting a long conversation with his comrades, he could make himself understood in simple matters. His behavior at the fight in Cholula had gained him the respect of the old soldier, who, however, was not wholly satisfied with him. "The young fellow is no coward," he said to Pedro. "When the Mexicans were pressing us sorely, he fought as stoutly and well as any in our ranks. He is well skilled in the use of the sword, which is wonderful, seeing that the Mexicans, among whom he has been brought up, are but poor hands with that weapon. And both with thrust and point he showed himself perfectly at home with the heavy blade the general gave him. I saw him pressed at one time by 4 Mexicans together, and was making to his assistance, but there was no need for it. He ran one through the body, and with heavy downright blows well nigh cleft the heads of 2 others, and the 4th, with a cry of astonishment and fear, sprang back into the crowd. But though he fought so stoutly when attacked, he showed less ardor in the assault, and lagged behind when we were pursuing the enemy." "I like him none the worse for that, Juan," Pedro said. "He has lived among these people, and though I hear that, when they heard of our landing, they would have sacrificed him, and he had to fly for his life and fight hard to make his escape, he must in other respects look upon them without animosity, and doubtless he felt some pity for the poor wretches." "I felt some pity myself," Juan said, "but as they had intended so treacherously towards us, and proposed to put us all to a cruel death, I did not let my pity interfere with my sword arm." "Ah, but you have been accustomed to battles and bloodshed all your life, Juan. One does not take to the trade of killing all at once, and I like him none the worse that he was disinclined for the slaughter of the people among whom he had been brought up." "Well, we shall see," the old soldier grumbled. "It seems to me that when 200 or 300 men are fighting against a whole nation, and that nation proposes to cut all their throats on the altars of their gods, it is not a time for scruples. I approve of the orders the general gave, that no one was to injure women and children, and I heartily wish that such were always the orders. But when it comes to men who have set their minds upon killing me, I don't draw nice distinctions, and I just smite where I see a chance." The news that the Spaniards had crossed the mountains and had entered the valley completed the dejection and despair of Montezuma, and after shutting himself up in his palace and refusing food, he at last turned from the gods, from whom he could obtain no assistance, and summoned a meeting of his counselors. These were divided in opinion. Cacama was at the head of the peace party. He pointed out that, had they intended to oppose the advance of the white men by force of arms, the whole strength of the empire should have been dispatched to dispute the passage of the mountains. As that had not been done, they should now be received in friendly fashion, as the ambassadors of the great king whom Cortez claimed to represent. Some of the other counselors, led by Cuitlahua, Montezuma's brother, were in favor of turning out all the forces and repelling the invasion. But Cacama's counsel prevailed, and an embassy was dispatched, under his leadership, to greet the Spaniards and conduct them to the capital. The Spanish army advanced slowly. They halted for 2 days at Amaquemecan, where they were well received and hospitably entertained, and presented with a considerable sum in gold. They then marched forward to Ajotzinco, a town standing at the southern extremity of Lake Chalco, and partly erected on piles rising from the lake itself. Here, as at Venice, canals took the place of roads, and all traffic was carried on in boats. Upon the following morning, a messenger arrived with the news that the King of Tezcuco was approaching, as an ambassador from the emperor, and in a short time the royal procession approached the city. Cacama was borne in a magnificent litter, shaded by a gorgeous canopy, and was attended by a number of nobles and officials. As the palanquin neared the spot where Cortez was standing, Cacama left his litter and advanced towards him, saluting by touching the ground with his hand and raising it in the air. Cortez also advanced and embraced the young prince, who told him that he came as the ambassador of the emperor to welcome him to his capital. An exchange of presents took place, and Cortez assured the prince of the friendliness of his intentions, and of the respect he entertained for the emperor. Cacama then withdrew and returned at once to Mexico, while the army resumed its march. Roger did not make any attempt to approach the prince after his interview with Cortez. He knew that he would have received from Cuitcatl the news that he had surmounted the dangers of his journey and joined the Spaniards at Tlascala, and thought it would be better to defer presenting himself to the prince until he could do so more privately at Tezcuco. He considered it possible that Montezuma might have blamed Cacama for his escape, and that, if he were to greet him, it would be reported to the emperor, who might regard it as a proof that there had been a secret understanding between them, and that Cacama had aided his flight. Crossing the causeway that divided the lake of Chalco from that of Zaquical, the army marched to Iztapalapan, a large town with a royal residence, governed by the emperor's brother, Cuitlahua. The prince had assembled a number of the great nobles, and Cortez was received with great state and ceremony. And after the usual presentation of gifts, a banquet was served to the Spaniards in one of the great halls of the palace. After this, Cortez was conducted over the gardens, which were the finest in Mexico. They contained all the vegetable productions of the empire, with magnificent aviaries and a fish pond built of stone, nearly a mile in circumference. At daybreak next morning, that of November 8th, 1519, the Spaniards were mustered and again set forward. The 400 white troops led the way. They were followed by the baggage, after which came what was numerically the main portion of the army, 6,500 Tlascalan soldiers. Keeping on by the shore of the lake and crossing the narrow strip of land dividing the lake of Xochical from that of Tezcuco, they arrived at the head of the great causeway running across the lake to the island on which the capital was built. The causeway was a massive construction, built of large stones laid in cement, and was wide enough to permit of 10 horsemen riding abreast. The shores of the lake on either side were closely dotted with towns and villages, and the lake itself was well nigh covered with the canoes and rafts of the natives. The Spaniards saw, too, with surprise and admiration, floating gardens, some of them of considerable extent, on the surface of the lake, covered with flowers and shrubs. The scene was the most beautiful that had ever met their eyes, and they were filled with delight and admiration. Halfway across the causeway, they came across the fort of Xoloc. Here a massive stone wall, 12 feet high, crossed the dike, and stretched out onto the lake on either side. Towers were erected at its angles, and properly defended, it could have resisted the attack of an army. An archway gave passage through the wall. Here a great number of nobles were assembled, who welcomed the Spaniards with formal ceremony, and the army then marched forward along the dike till it reached a wooden drawbridge near the gate of the city. As they crossed this, a splendid procession was seen approaching. It was preceded by 3 great officers of state, bearing golden wands. Behind them the emperor himself lay in his palanquin, borne on the shoulders of nobles, with a canopy of rich featherwork sparkling with jewels above his head. Montezuma alighted when within a short distance, and with the canopy still carried over his head, and leaning upon his brother and nephew, he advanced towards Cortez. The general, dismounting, went forward with a few of his principal officers to meet him. The emperor received his guest with courtesy, and expressed his pleasure at seeing him in his capital, while Cortez replied with expressions of profound respect, accompanied by thanks for the superb presents that Montezuma had sent him. The emperor re-entered his litter, and the Spaniards followed, with music playing and colors flying. Although already familiar with Mexican architecture, they were astonished by the magnificence of the buildings that bordered the great streets along which they marched. Here were the mansions of the nobles, built of a red porous stone, and covering a large space of ground. The flat roofs were protected by stone parapets, and many of them were laid out as gardens. Between these mansions were broad terraces, which presented a mass of flowers. Here and there were great marketplaces, surrounded by porticos of stone, and above all the temples, with their towering pyramids, rose high in the air. Along the whole line, crowds of people watched the procession of the troops, gazing with surprise and admiration at the cavaliers on horseback, and at the flashing armor and arms of the Spaniards, and with wrath and indignation at the Tlascalan army, which followed in their rear. The street was in many places intersected by canals. Passing over these on light bridges, they at last reached a great square near the center of the city, on one side of which rose the huge temple of the war god of the Aztecs. Facing this was a palace of Montezuma's father, which had been appropriated by the emperor as quarters for the Spaniards. The emperor himself received them in the courtyard, presented Cortez with a magnificent necklace, and then, saying he would visit them later on, withdrew. The palace was large enough to afford accommodation for the whole army, and as it was surrounded by a massive stone wall, flanked with towers, Cortez saw, with satisfaction, that it could without difficulty resist any sudden attack. He placed sentries on the walls, and planted his cannon to command the approaches, and in order to prevent any chance of a quarrel arising, he forbade any soldiers to leave the palace without orders. A large number of Mexican slaves had been appointed to attend upon the strangers, and a meal was speedily served by them to the troops, who were then permitted to take a sleep for some hours during the heat of the day. The emperor paid another visit in the evening, and had a long conversation with Cortez, distributing a large number of rich presents among the Spaniards before leaving. After he had left, they celebrated their arrival in the city by a salute with their cannon, whose thunder added to the impression produced upon the natives by the tales they had heard of the prowess of their visitors, and heightened their belief in the supernatural powers of the Spaniards. The next day Cortez returned the emperor's visit. He was accompanied by a few of his principal officers and 5 or 6 soldiers. The palace was of immense size, built, like the rest of the houses, of red stone, and ornamented with marble. Fountains sparkled in the courts through which the Spaniards passed, and crowds of Aztec nobles thronged the squares and great halls. The walls of these apartments were hung with richly dyed cotton, or with draperies of gorgeous featherwork, while the fumes of incense rose up in clouds from censers. Montezuma, surrounded by a few of his nobles, received them, and Cortez at once opened to him what he considered to be the chief object of his enterprise, and through the medium of Marina expounded the doctrines of Christianity, and besought the emperor to turn from his false gods. As Montezuma had himself been a priest, and was an ardent devotee of his religion, it was scarcely to be expected that he would favorably entertain the proposal to change his religion. He answered courteously that, no doubt, the God of Cortez was good to the Spaniards, just as his own gods were good to him. What his visitors said of the creation of the world was similar to what he himself believed. His people had occupied the land but for a few years, having been led there by a great being who, after giving them laws, had withdrawn to the regions of the east. When he left, he had promised that he or his descendants would again visit them and resume his empire. The wonderful deeds of the Spaniards, their complexion, the fact that they came from the east, all showed that they were the descendants of this god. Your sovereign beyond the waters is, I know, the rightful lord of all. I rule in his name. You, Mallinson, are his ambassador, and you and your brethren shall share what I have." He then dismissed his visitors with fresh presents. Mallinson was the name by which Cortez was universally known by the natives. Malinche was ever with him, and they connected him with her and called him by the masculine form of her name. But gratified as the Spaniards were at the kindness of their reception, and within the munificent gifts showered upon them, they could not but feel that their position was a precarious one. They were in the center of a great city, with a warlike population. It was broken up by its canals with their movable bridges into a series of fortresses, and it would be well nigh hopeless to endeavor by force to make their way out of it. At present all seemed fair, but they were well aware that Montezuma had endeavored in every way, save by open war, to prevent their coming, and that, influenced as he was by the oracles of the gods, he might at any moment exchange his apparent friendship for open enmity. 2 days after arriving at the capital, Roger asked Malinche if she could obtain permission from the general for him to cross the lake to Tezcuco, in order that he might pay his friends there a visit. Presently she returned, saying that the general himself would speak to him. Roger had been named Sancho by the Spaniards, as he had not ventured to give his own name, and it was supposed that he had forgotten that which he had borne as a child. "Sancho," the general said, "I know from what Marina says that you have great intelligence, though you have so long been cut off from your own people. You see that our position here is a strange one. We are guests, and yet, to some extent, we are prisoners. The Tlascalans with us are hated by the Mexicans, and either between them and the natives, or maybe between some of my own soldiers and the citizens, a brawl might arise which would be used as a pretext for an attack upon us. As I feel that I can rely upon your discretion, I will tell you of some news that I received at Cholula, but which I have kept to myself. The natives on the coast have shown themselves hostile to the garrison of 150 men, whom I left there under Juan de Escalante. A chief near there sent in to tender his allegiance, and asked that 4 white men should be sent to escort him to the town. As soon as they got to him, 2 of them were murdered, but the other 2 managed to escape and made their way back. Don Juan marched with 50 of his men and several thousand Indian allies to attack the treacherous chief. There was a desperate battle. Our allies fled, but the soldiers stood their ground and, thanks to the aid of the Blessed Virgin, resisted all the attacks made upon them. But 8 of the men were slain, and Juan himself was mortally wounded. The Indian prisoners taken said that the attack, like that at Cholula, had been made by the orders of Montezuma. You may do us good service by finding out what are the intentions of the Mexicans. Therefore, by all means, carry out your intention of going across to Tezcuco. The young king is a nephew of the emperor, but he has suffered much at Montezuma's hands, and has been stripped of the greater part of his father's dominions. He can, therefore, hardly be friendly to him at heart. At any rate, you may be able to learn in conversation with him what are his sentiments towards us. Tezcuco was long the rival of Mexico, and as the alliance of the Tlascalans has proved of the greatest advantage to us, still more should we benefit if the Tezcucans were our friends. If we have to retire from Mexico, we might take refuge there. At any rate, if nothing else comes of it, you might learn from the king whether he is aware of any treachery meditated against us. He saved you, Malinche says, from Montezuma and the priests once, and would be likely, therefore, to warn you did he know that danger was impending." When Marina had translated this, Roger at once agreed to do his best to discover if any treachery were meant. "You had best go in disguise," Cortez said. "Donna Marina will make arrangements for a canoe to be here after nightfall, and by staining your face and putting on the attire of an Aztec noble, for which we have ample materials at hand, would not be noticed as you passed through the throng of yon boats on the lake. It would be best that you did not go as a Spanish soldier. You might be arrested on the road, and perhaps carried away and sacrificed at one of the altars. Once at Tezcuco, you must, of course, act in the matter as you think best." Marina, who was not, like the Spaniards, confined to the palace, had no difficulty in arranging for a canoe; and as soon as it became dark, Roger, dressed as an Aztec cazique, and with his face slightly stained, took his place in it. The lake was thronged with canoes, but the craft in which he was seated passed without notice through them, and after 2 hours' paddling reached Tezcuco. Telling the natives that they were to wait for his return, however long that might be, Roger proceeded to the palace. Avoiding the principal streets and squares, where his unusual height would attract attention, he passed unquestioned into the palace, amid the throng of chiefs and nobles who were entering or leaving it, and made his way to the apartment of Cuitcatl. It was empty, but, clapping his hand, the attendant who had before waited upon him entered. As Roger's attire was similar to the one he had worn while at Tezcuco, the man recognized him at once. Roger bade him go in search of Cuitcatl, and tell him privately that he was there, and beg him to come. In a few minutes Cuitcatl entered the room, and greeted Roger most heartily. "I am glad indeed to see you, my friend, and Cacama and the queen and the princess will rejoice also. There was great anxiety for you after your first escape, for the emperor was furious when he heard that you had slipped off. The priests had assured him that the sacrifice of a white man to the god of war would ensure his aid and protection against the white invaders. Runners were dispatched in scores to every town and village, and although I knew that Bathalda was familiar with every foot of the country, and would give his life for you, if needs be, it seemed impossible that you should be able to make your way through. Then came the news of your flight in the hills, how you had a bow that carried arrows to an unheard-of distance, and how, in a hand-to-hand fight, you had prevailed against a score of our soldiers. After that, you seemed lost. The officers commanding the troops were convinced that you had not descended the eastern slopes of the mountains, and the spies which were watching every movement of the white men on the coast reported that no white man had joined them. Therefore, it was supposed that you must have returned west of the range of hills, and every town and village was searched, and every grove and plantation examined. We were all very anxious for you, and it was not until a week after we had the news of the wonderful defeat of the Tlascalans by the white men that Bathalda returned with the message you sent us, and the news that you had joined the white men there. Since then we have, of course, heard nothing of you. Cacama said that he did not see you when he met Malinzin, but of course he did not examine the faces of the white soldiers, being occupied solely with their chief and the officers round him. But we all felt assured that we should hear from you shortly." "So you have resumed your Aztec dress?" "I thought it better to do so, for the purpose of coming here," Roger replied. "For if the priests want a victim so sorely, it seemed to me that, if I ventured to leave the palace dressed in my Spanish garb, I might be seized and carried off." "You are quite right," Cuitcatl agreed. "The priests are furious against you all, and I cannot altogether blame them. Your general may, as he says, come as an ambassador from his king to Montezuma, and if he had orders to come to his court at all costs, he was not to blame if he fought his way whenever he was opposed. But this does not justify him in insulting our religion, and even assaulting and hurling down our gods at every opportunity. He even tried to persuade the emperor that our gods were false, and spoke insolently of them yesterday. when Montezuma conducted him, at his request, into the holy shrines. Cacama was one of the strongest advisers that a peaceful reception should be accorded to the white visitors, but even he is being greatly turned against them by their conduct towards our gods. Come, I will take you to the royal apartments, and leave you in a room where no one will enter, until I inform Cacama that you are here." A few minutes later the young king entered the apartment where Cuitcatl had placed Roger, and embraced him with real affection. "Truly I am glad to see you again, Roger Hawkshaw. I am glad to see you for yourself, and I hail you as a counselor in the strange pass to which we have come. Here are Maclutha and my sister Amenche." The queen and the princess entered as he spoke, and each gave Roger their hand, which, bowing deeply, he raised to his lips, having before told them that this was the salutation, among his own people, to ladies of high rank. "We did not think, Roger Hawkshaw, when we last parted, that we should meet again so soon. Who would have believed, then, that the little band of white men, of whose arrival upon the coast we had heard, would have made their way on to the capital, when the emperor was bent upon preventing their coming? We have trembled for you, and have prayed the gods to protect you, and greatly did we rejoice when we heard, from Cuitcatl's follower, that you had surmounted all your dangers safely, and joined the whites. It has been a strange time here since you left. I have been for the most part at the capital. The news that came from day to day of the progress of the whites filled everyone with surprise and consternation. We of the council met daily, but Montezuma passed his time at the shrines and among the priests. He was a brave warrior and a great general once, but he is no longer himself. My father's prophecy seems to have unmanned him, and he has given himself up wholly to superstition. I believe in our gods, and pay them due honor, but I do not hold that a man should not think for himself, or that he should trust wholly in the priests, who are but men like ourselves, and who are, methinks, but poor judges of worldly affairs, though wise and learned in matters concerning religion. Montezuma thinks otherwise, and the result is that no orders have been issued, no determination arrived at, and we have the disgrace of seeing a handful of strangers installed in the capital. Mind, my counsels have always been that they should be conducted honorably from the coast and treated as ambassadors, but we have done neither one thing nor the other. They have been loaded with gifts, but forbidden to come here. Yet since they came, in spite of orders, we have seemed as if we feared to meet them, and I blush at the thought of the treacherous plan to destroy them at Cholula. The gods had prophesied that they would find their grave there, but the gods were wrong, and it may be that the God of the whites is more powerful than ours. If not, how is it that they did not avenge the indignities offered to them by the whites at Cempoala, where their images were hurled down from their altars, and at Cholula, where the most sacred of all the temples was attacked and captured, and the emblem of the white god set up on its summit? You yourself, Roger Hawkshaw, warned us against these Spaniards. You said that they were cruel masters to the people they had conquered, and above all things cruel in the matter of religion, forcing all who came under their sway to accept their god under pain of death, and that they would slay even you, a white man like themselves, did they know that you did not belong to their people. Tell us what is to be done. Why are these men in our capital? What are their objects? Brave and strong as they are, they cannot hope to overcome a nation, or to force all Anahuac to forsake their own gods and to accept the god of the whites. I know not what are the designs of Cortez, the leader whom you call Malinzin. I should say the Spaniards are here with several motives. In the first place, there is the desire for wealth and spoil. In the second, religious ardor, the desire to bring all within the pale of their church. In the third place, the love of adventure. And lastly, the honor they will receive at the hands of their sovereign for opening so rich an empire to his arms. Do you not think, then, they intend to conquer us? Cortez cannot think of doing so with the means at his disposal, Cacama, but doubtless he has sent home reports of the richness of the country, and forces many times more numerous than those under his command may be sent out to his assistance. "Does he know that you have come hither?" Cacama asked suddenly. "He does," Roger replied. "I could not leave the palace without permission, and Malinche told him of the kindness I had experienced at your hands. He himself is uneasy at the position in which he finds himself, uncertain of Montezuma's intentions, and fearful of an assault, and he bade me to try to find out, as far as might be, what was the general opinion respecting the Spaniards." "The opinion of the ignorant," Cacama said, with a contemptuous wave of the hand, "is worth nothing. They go where they are led. They believe what they are last told. They shout when they are told to shout. They have no opinion of their own, upon aught but what relates to themselves. Among the nobles, the priests, and the learned, there is much division of opinion. At present we wait. But frankly, at any moment a storm may follow the calm. The priests, who of course are bitterly hostile to the strangers, are without doubt working, and they have great power with all. But I should say that, on the whole, you are safer here with me than you would be across the water there. I do not mean that there is any immediate danger, but you must remember that Montezuma has been insulted and humiliated, and made to appear small in the sight of the people. He is one of the proudest of men, and although at present he feigns friendship with the Spaniards, a moment will come when he will revolt against being thus bearded in his capital, and he has but to wave his hand for these invaders to be wiped out. However, let us talk of other matters at present. Of course, you are not thinking of returning tonight." "I intended to do so, and the canoe in which I came is waiting for me." "We cannot think of letting you go," Cacama said decidedly. "I will send an official back with a message from you, saying that you think you can do more here than by returning, and that you crave leave to stay for the present, but that you will come over in the morning and report to him all that you have learned here. You can leave here soon after daybreak, see your general, and be back again before the full heat of the day." As Roger was in no hurry to return, Cuitcatl went out to dispatch an official with the message to Cortez, or rather to Malinche, as the message would then be delivered privately to him. Whereas, if Cortez were asked for, the man might be brought into his presence when engaged with some of his officers. Roger did not know whether the fact of his being away from the palace had been made public, for Cortez might consider it would cause discontent among some of his followers were it known that their last joined recruit was permitted to leave the town, whereas no one else was allowed to stir beyond the limits of their quarters. End of chapter 14.